Hi there, welcome back to the new haircut version of Gordon Ross in IndyCar, and it's the 30th of October today. Now, as usual, I've got three stories to discuss today. The first one, I think, is an interesting example of the kind of double standards that you see on BBC News reporting. And it's come to light in the press today, and not in the BBC or the mainstream media, by the way, but just online, that a new ferry, which was procured by, I think it was the island of Guernsey, to serve these southernmost outposts of the British Empire, has not been quite as successful as they thought it would be. This ferry, which was apparently built in Holland, was recently commissioned to run its first passenger services to the Channel Islands. Unfortunately, after a mere 3 days of operating, it promptly broke down and has had to be returned for some repairs and is out of service. Now, the Island Council, I believe, put up some £25 million to procure this ferry. And the BBC has said nothing about the ferries going to Guernsey having problems, but apparently the bow thrusters in this particular ferry failed to work properly, and so it was unable to manoeuvre itself into harbour. Whereas the Calmac ferries, which serve the outer islands in Scotland, have been running for years now with a 99% punctuality and reliability rate. So why is the BBC not reporting problems with the ferries in the Channel Islands? Well, I think you can all answer that quite easily, because it's not in Scotland and it's nothing to do with the SNP. So whose fault is it? Well, it's obviously those Dutch people that built the ship. You can't blame this on the British state in any way, and you certainly couldn't blame it on the people of Guernsey who paid for it. But it's still a ferry disaster, and yet it's received absolutely no coverage whatsoever in the mainstream media. So the usual double standard. And speaking of double standards, brings me to another tale to do with the water, and that is the Union Canal. You may remember that the famous Chain of Freedom event, which was so successful recently in basically attracting over 40,000 independent supporters to form a human chain along, first of all, the Forth and Clyde Canal, was thwarted in its attempt to create a human chain from Glasgow all the way to Edinburgh by, I believe it's now called Scottish Waterways, who claimed that the Union Canal's towpath was dangerous and that it was too narrow and that people might fall in the water, and therefore, from the point of view of health and safety, they couldn't have the human chain extending all the way between Glasgow and Edinburgh. But then again, news has emerged today that the very same people, the same Scottish Waterways people, have said that it's perfectly safe. In fact, not only perfectly safe, they're inviting thousands of people to come down to the Union Canal in the pitch darkness to witness what they say will be a parade, a lantern parade of narrowboats. Now, call me cynical, but surely it's far more dangerous for people to walk along this allegedly dangerous narrow footpath in the dark than it would be for a human chain to join hands in broad daylight when they can see the edges of the canal. And yet, no, they're expecting thousands of people to come along and put their lives at risk to watch some canal boats with lanterns on them sailing past. So why is this? Could it be because Edinburgh sees itself as a little bit of Britain, perhaps? Or could it just be that the people who are running Scottish Waterways, or the ones who make the decisions on health and safety aspects, are, shall we say, have a colonised mind, a colonised viewpoint, where they think that we can't really have some political stunt where people join hands all the way between the two major cities of Scotland and cause a human chain across the narrowest part of the country. That wouldn't work. That wouldn't be fair. But it's perfectly all right to put the lives of thousands of visitors at risk in the dark to watch some canal boats going past. Well, again, the double standard, I think, is, well, I was going to say it shines brightly, but it's pretty dark, according to all accounts, along the Union Canal at night time. So, again, what's going on here? Well, I think this is political gerrymandering on the part of whoever is the health and safety representative for Scottish Waterways. And that brings me to a piece of what some people have seen as very good news, which is the news that Ash Regan, the unsuccessful but popular runner-up, I think you might say, almost, in the leadership race for the SNP some months ago, has now decided that her future lies with the Alba party. So she has joined Alba and becomes Alba's first ever MSP. Now this is interesting in a number of ways because, for one thing, I suppose it's a good thing because it means that Alba has representation in the heart of the Scottish Parliament, somewhere where it just hasn't had access to up until now. Ash Regan is, well, let's be fair to Ash Regan, she's an immensely, I would say, successful professional politician. And I think it's kind of obvious that she would have been a bit disappointed at not getting anywhere close to being elected as the new leader of the SNP. And to be fair, many people would have preferred to have seen her rather than Mr. Youssef. However, her move from the SNP to Alba is being seen by some as marking some kind of threshold where a senior SNP political figure, as senior as Ms. Regan, has decided to throw her lot in with Alba. And she appeared at Alba's most recent conference and gave apparently a barnstorming speech which received a standing ovation. All to the good, I think, in terms of producing some plurality of independent support in the Scottish Parliament. Does it mean that Alba has crossed some threshold itself? Has it crossed the Rubicon and become more mainstream in Scottish politics? Well, that remains to be seen. Of course, they have 2 MPs at Westminster at the moment, and they'll be looking, obviously, to get them re-elected or at least improve their position in Westminster in the next general election. Ash Regan, I think, would be a wonderful First Minister, but she's going to be on her own in Holyrood for the time being, at least. The question in my mind is not so much about Ash Regan, but does the Alba party have a different strategy, sufficiently different from the SNP's, to warrant people switching sides in the same way? And I think at the moment, looking at what Alba is proposing to do in the next general election with their Scotland United plan, where all of the independence parties get together and mount a joint campaign, is fine up to a point, but the end result of this campaign, if it were to go ahead, is going to be very much the same as what Humza Yousaf's plan was, that if they win a majority of seats, they're then going to wave that majority of seats in front of the UK government and say, this is a mandate for us to become independent. Now, this is where things become the same, because at this point Alba has just fallen short of saying that it would empower the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum if they won this, because that's actually what's needed here. But Alba's not saying that, at least not at the moment. They're not saying that this will be a mandate to hold an independence referendum and to empower the Scottish Parliament to do that, because that's really what we have to do if we want to actually get independence. It's no use saying that it's untenable for the United Kingdom if we win the majority of seats in the next general election. We know that the United Kingdom doesn't care whether something's tenable or not. They will just say no. And the reason they can just say no is that there are no consequences to them for saying no. They could say no forever, and it would make absolutely zero difference to the UK. Nothing would happen to them. They wouldn't be censured, they wouldn't be removed from power, they would not be criticised or sanctioned by international courts or anything like that. Things would just stay at a standstill, and we would have won the maximum number of seats, or we would have won the majority of seats, but we'd be no further forwards. So if Alba is to make any kind of major breakthrough in Holyrood, it needs to take one step further, in my opinion this is, and go that little bit further than the SNP and say, if we win a majority of seats, or if a majority of pro-independence MPs are elected, then that should empower the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum. That means repudiating the Union at that moment and saying the Union is effectively over, we're suspending it for the time being, and the people have voted by gaining this majority to hold the referendum in Scotland without the UK's say-so. Alex Salmond, back in the day, back in 2012, when the first independence referendum was to be called, sat down and created a thing called the Edinburgh Agreement. And the Edinburgh Agreement was signed by himself and by the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron. And that agreement made the 2014 referendum binding, which it would not otherwise have been. And because of that, had we won that referendum in 2014, we would have been independent by now, because it would have been self-executing. Now, the United Kingdom is never going to allow that to happen again. So, trying to get a Section 30 order from the United Kingdom, even if we got one, would not result in the Edinburgh Agreement being signed again, and that would mean that any referendum held with the agreement of the UK would not be binding, and we would be back to saying this is untenable. The United Kingdom cannot refuse. The people have voted for independence and they're not letting us have it. And the United Kingdom would keep saying no forever, because there's no consequences. They're not going to be punished for doing that, and we would be back where we are right now. So what is needed is for that referendum to be held under the, shall we say, the competence of its own parliament, under the Scottish Government's own competence to do so, the Scottish Parliament's competence. And that can only be done if it's specified in this manifesto of either Alba or the SNP, or both of them, or in fact both of them and the Greens, if they all agreed to do so, that any win in the next general election is a manifesto, not a manifesto, is a mandate for the Scottish Parliament to be fully impaired, the Union suspended while the people of Scotland decide for themselves whether or not they wish the Union to continue. Because we can't unilaterally announce our independence unless the people of Scotland have had a free and fair referendum. An election will not do it, because an election is not intended to decide a matter like this, and the United Kingdom would reject it. But using the next general election as not just a de facto referendum, but a plebiscite on impairing the Scottish Parliament. Now, that's not saying that we're going to become independent if we win a majority, but it does say that we will impair our own Parliament using our own popular sovereignty, so that we can hold a referendum in which people who want the Union to end can vote yes, and those who don't want the Union to end can vote no, in a free and fair referendum, without any meddling by the United Kingdom or its organisations or its electoral commission or any of its politicians. And that's really the only way to decide this. And I think, frankly, anyone jumping ship to Alba at the moment, fine, that's fine, you know, by all means switch from the SNP to Alba if you want. But it's not going to change anything until Alba or the SNP come up with some kind of manifesto pledge which includes the empowerment of the Scottish Parliament to take this decision. It's all about sovereignty. It's all about the people's sovereignty, and those people telling their Scottish Parliament and their Scottish Government and their Scottish MPs that if a certain result goes a certain way, that means that we have the referendum. And that's really the only way it can be done. Which brings me to one last little item of news, which I heard today from the convener of Yes Tweeddale, in which I gave a talk recently, back in September, on, first of all, on Salvo and the Stirling Directive, and I spoke at length to a crowd of at least 50 people in that hall, and I asked them to think about what I'd been saying in my talk about Salvo and about Scottish sovereignty, and asked them as a group if they would like to vote to join Salvo and to become part of the sovereignty movement. And I heard today that they have voted to join Salvo, and that group is now affiliated, or will be affiliated, with Salvo. This is just what I hope is the start of many Yes groups across Scotland joining Salvo as a group rather than as individuals. It's much easier for a group to affiliate, and it's much more difficult for the United Kingdom's GCHQ spooks to interfere with the sign-up if we have a group convener writing on paper, perhaps, to Salvo saying our group has decided to join, and that means every member of that group becomes part of Salvo, and if they wish they can also become part of Liberation Scotland, the organisation which campaigns for the referendum and the yes vote eventually, and also which will take our case to higher courts outside of the United Kingdom. So all of that is good news. I see Ash Regan's change of party as a stepping stone, but I'm hoping that Ash Regan can see the wisdom of what I've been saying and what many other commentators have been saying, particularly Peter Bell, writers like Peter Bell, who have said exactly the same thing as I'm saying to you. Scotland needs to repudiate the Union if it wins a majority of seats, and it needs to empower its own parliament to hold a referendum which is actually about independence, which is not a general election, because that is the way that we will win. And when we do win at a referendum which is self-executing, and that is a key part of having a Scottish referendum, a self-executing referendum means that you will be independent after a yes vote, and there will be no argument from anyone about that. It must be clearly understood right from the start. There would be no Edinburgh Agreement, there would be no involvement of the UK political parties, the UK's Electoral Commission, or the UK government, or its media, or anybody else. This would be purely a Scottish decision, and that is exactly what should happen. So I hope Ash Regan thinks about this, as well as her career as an MSP, and perhaps does something in Alba to change that manifesto for next year's general election to include that extra step which empowers the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum, because without that, Alba's offering and the SNP's offering are largely the same, and they end up at the same point where we win and we say, well, it's untenable for the United Kingdom to refuse us, but they refuse us anyway. We need that extra step. Anyway, that's the news for today. So we've got a load of double standards going on with ferries and with the Canal system linking Edinburgh to Falkirk, and we have this piece of political news with Ash Regan now joining Alba and becoming its first MSP in Holyrood. That's it from IndyCar today. I should be back again later on in the week. In the meantime, thank you to everyone who's continued to donate. Please use the link if you wish to make a donation. It's useful, always useful to me, and it helps me to produce more and more content. But as I always say, keep the faith. Things are changing. It's just they could do with changing a little bit more as far as Alba and the SNP are concerned. But we live in hope. That's it from me today. I'll see you all again later in the week. Bye for now.